Reverend Leah, thank you so much for inviting us to Lancaster Priory to hear about the Facing the Past project and the work that you've been doing. We're also interested to learn the thinking and the rationale behind the project.
When I arrived as vicar in 2021, the church was in the initial stages of responding to the Black Lives Matter protests. And during those protests here in Lancaster, there is a memorial outside, the Lindo Rawlinson Memorial, and that had been sprayed in red with the word slave trader. And really they were beginning to think about how do we respond to this history? We've got all these memorials, we've got all these streets, not just in the Priory, but there are kind of street names across the city, grand buildings across the city, which represent the people in the 18th century who, of course, were quite wealthy and were building these things. But we didn't really talk about how they were wealthy and why they were wealthy and why they had such big and important memorials. And, of course, that is because of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So the first project then was happening just as I arrived, which was about running art workshops and enabling people through different forms of art to create images in their imagination and then on paper using collage and all sorts of things of black people living in Lancaster throughout the ages. And during that time, we were also running a consultation asking those who were doing the art, how much do you know about our history? And what do you think we should do about this history? How do you think we should respond to it? The city has a memorial on the quayside, a memorial to captured Africans, which has been there for quite a while, but not everybody knows it's there. Yeah. Not everybody knows why it's there. Yeah. And that consultation brought out the fact that actually we're not being taught this part of our history. We don't, why. Why have we got all these grand Georgian buildings across the city? There's a huge lack of knowledge, and we're not teaching that part of history in our schools. And we know that question was already being raised by primary school teachers and teachers in education, saying, how do we teach this sensitively, but also how do we be honest? How do we tell the truth? So a bid went into the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we were awarded a bid to address dominantly an educational deficit in this area. So the first phase had already produced a primary school series of lessons, kind of a set of lessons that could be delivered in school. The second phase has delivered a trail, and that trail has been developed with primary school teachers, with an educational specialist, with the support of academics and historians. And it's working multi-agency. So the whole of this second phase of the project is working multi-agency with the local museums, with local schools, with the universities, with Lancaster Priory, with the local Black History Group, all working together. So far, 32 schools have done a trail around the city and explored their history. When the children come and do their slavery trail around Lancaster, when they come into the Priory, they come here, and they come and see this marker to John Satterthwaite. So John Satterthwaite owned a slave, the family owned a plantation, but John's slave was Frances Elizabeth Johnson, and he was baptised here, and he brought her to be baptised here as well. The candelabra were donated to the Priory. So there was a father and son. Father owned a plantation, and when the father died, in his will he asked the son to sell the plantation. So the son was not to keep it, was to sell the plantation. And the year after, the Priory had 3 great candelabra donated.
So this is the Lindo Rawlinson Monument, and this is where the concerted effort to tackle this period of history started after the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, it's quite hidden away really in some ways. We're right at the edge of the churchyard, but obviously there it is for all to see. the children come here when they come on their tour, and graffiti is a form of activism and protest that really ignites a passion in children. Children are like, actually, this should stay forever. And on the one hand, I want there to be something here that says what this place is, and that this grand monument remembers people who did awful, heinous things. I want to do that, I do want to do that, but I also think that the graffiti is going to start to wash off if we don't do something about it. So there are 58 records of baptisms of black Africans in the 18th century. Wow. In Lancaster Priory. They'd have been baptised at this font. And
this is the very font?
This is the very font.
Wow.
So Frances Elizabeth Johnson was baptised here. There's only one child in that 58, and that's Sophia Feline, who was 11, and she was baptised in this font.
Do we know anything else about her other than she was 11 years old and we know her name?
We know her name, we know that she was black, and we know that she was baptised in February 1799. We don't know a lot about what was going on, particularly when those people who we have different distinctions in the register. So we know when people were slaves, and we know when we think they might not be, because the categories are slightly different as to how people are. If they're a pauper, then they're not a slave. And so sometimes we know a little bit more about them. We don't always know the motives behind why people are being baptised, their own motives, or in fact, if they were enslaved, whether or not the motives of their owners was about some kind of assimilation into the household, if you like, as a Christian household. But I like to think of baptism as being about the grace of God, so being about something that's far bigger than human motivations. But also, for me, baptism is about being given our identity as a child of God, of being born again in Christ. And for me, the imagery of freedom is one of great hope. And I really do hope that there would have been some comfort in that there would have been an aspiration of a better world and of a better time. And whilst the church in that day was not part of bringing that kingdom in, the church needs to be that today.
The thing I think I'm most excited by is that we've discovered, here at the Priory alone, 76 entries in our registers of black people, black Africans, who were baptised, who had funerals here, or who were married here. And there are more than that. Yeah. Those are only the ones on the registers, they're only the ones that are here. And beginning to think about, well, what do we do about them? Because we have forgotten them. We have not remembered them. Their names might have been in the pages of books that have been dusty and away in cupboards, and we've not remembered their stories. And that's where it gets quite exciting, I think. And in part, I think the impact of the project going forward is that if we can forget people in the past, we can forget people today, and we can forget people in the future by educating people, by raising awareness, by telling the stories of those who are underrepresented and who've been erased from our history, essentially. We help to create a future where we value every person and every story in our community. There's a really important learning about black presence for me, because that takes me to a place where I know that the world now is not right, and that it's not okay just because slavery has been abolished. It isn't okay. Racism is still alive and real in my own community, and whilst I have the privilege of not being directly a target of that, I do see evidence of that. And that's where the second half of the project comes in. So the adult education piece hasn't just been about history, it's been about anti-racism. It's been about modern day slavery. It's been about how do we talk about race? How do we understand our own identity? And so that's been not just for the Priory congregations, but also for those who work and volunteer in the museums and across all of the organisations that are working in partnership, but also in our local council. Trying to impact others outside of the church by modelling that actually we need to learn to be different. And one of the best ways of learning is looking at, well, what's happened in the past.